Well, I think some of you guys may know me. I'm Mark DeLuzio. I'm head of Lean Horizons Consulting, and my background comes out of Danaher, and I was the principal architect of the Danaher business system. And in, what was it? 2008, I got recruited to be on the board for a company called Hillenbrand. And at the time, Hillenbrand was a separate spinoff of a bigger company. And we only owned one company. It was called Batesville Casket. And then from then we grew with all kinds of different acquisitions. Today, I think, I don't know, Anthony, what is it? $3 billion or something like that.
Close to it, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big company now, and they've got all kinds of different businesses all over the world. But Anthony sort of cut his teeth and grew up in all kinds of different roles in finance and human resources and operations, logistics. I mean, he was all over the place. And to me, he was one of the best leaders in Hillenbrand from a lean perspective and from a leadership perspective. But why was he such a good leader as a leader? It's because he is one of the few guys, that I've met that said, hey, you know what? I screwed up. Matter of fact, if you read his book, he talks about how he made such a mistake in what he's talking about today with how you deal with grief as a leader. Okay, he's one of those guys that doesn't have a problem with opening up his kimono and saying, "Hey, I screwed up," and I need to now really think about this. So instead of trying to cover his mistakes, right? So that always attracted me to him. I mean, all the other things, strategic and business acumen and lean and all that, yeah, those are all there and they're phenomenal. But was really that humbleness that he brought to the table that made him such a good leader, and be able to look back and say he made a mistake. I look back at my career and I say, yeah, I made one mistake, maybe. No, I made a lot. So anyway, I got to know Anthony a lot. And then when he retired from Hillenbrand, and I've been doing my Lean Horizons along with being on the board. I'm off the board now. I was on the board for 11 years. So I got to get to know Anthony quite a bit. And not only are we friends personally, but we're business colleagues as well. And he came to me and he was going to start a consulting company in this space. And I said, man, this is phenomenal because nobody's doing this. I mean, some people talk about it, but he has a very unique background in this regard. In addition to being associated with he and his brother, Guy, who's not on, the death care industry, where, where else is grief, right? I mean, there it is, right? And we've all been associated with death in one way or the other, okay? But he brings to the party something a little bit different. He says, it's not just about death. There's grief all over the place in all kinds of different regards. And I'm sure he's going to talk about that. So, so I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. And I just want to say that this is a key element. If you're really serious about doing lean, this is a key element in what we all talk about all the time with respect for people. That's a Toyota way, the Toyota principle of respect for people. And this to me is a missing element. Okay. And that's why I was really attracted to working with Anthony on this and doing these webinars and what have you. So anyway, I'll shut up now and let him take it over. How's that?
Well, I appreciate that, Mark. Thanks so much. And please don't ever feel you have to cut anything short on my account. That's for sure. And I certainly appreciate.
You may regret that.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate all the support and guidance that you've given Guy and I through this process. So welcome, everyone. This is actually the first in a series of these talks that we're going to do, these webinars. We thought it would be best to break these down into chunks. And as you can see here on the screen, we're actually going to do probably 6 or 7 of these. We will keep them all under an hour. Some may butt right up against the hour. Most of them will probably be a little shorter. Today's session, we're going to just talk about what the problem is, right? And then as we step through each month, these will all be on the 4th Wednesday of every month. You can see the topics that we will cover there. In the June session, we're going to talk about emotional safety in the workplace. And then July, one of the things we talk about in our book is an adaptive leadership model that I've used throughout my career. And we're going to introduce that in session 3, and then session 4, we'll talk about how to use that in these situations in the workplace. And then session 6 will be the link to strategic initiatives, right? Because one of the things that we hear all the time from organizations is this is really good stuff, but we have so much other things, so many other things going on that we don't see where this fits in, or we don't know that we can carve out time to put our leaders through this training. And the reality is, if folks would, as Mark had suggested, think about this and how this would link to their initiatives, if you can build a culture like we're going to talk about over the next 7 sessions, it actually would make getting the rest of the initiatives easier to get done, frankly. But, I certainly understand in this post-COVID world, with organizations wanting to get back to pre-COVID profitability levels, they do have a whole lot of stuff going on. And so, we're more than happy to work through those kinds of things with the organizations. But we will spend a session just linking this to all the other strategic initiatives that companies have going on. So Mark talked a little bit about my background, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of a glimpse into a little bit more depth on myself, as well as my brother, because together, when you combine our experiences, you get a pretty interesting, actually a fairly peculiar background for the two of us. So, as Mark said, I spent 31 years in leadership positions with Hillenbrand Industries. 12 of those were in C-suite roles. I was the vice president of human resources. I was the vice president of logistics, the vice president of operations. We then combined those two, and I became the vice president of supply chain. And the last 3 years of my career, I spent actually as president of an operating company based in Cincinnati that is a subsidiary of the new Hillenbrand. And formally trained in accounting, although I seldom share that with folks. And just sort of cut my teeth in an organization that really thrived on developing individuals and leaders, and was given lots of opportunity to grow personally and professionally with Hillenbrand. 28 of those 31 years, though, was on the Batesville casket side of the business. And so I grew up, I guess you would say, on the death care side of the business, which leads me to my brother. So Guy, my brother Guy, who is 10 years younger than I, is a duly licensed funeral director. He's owned a couple of businesses of his own that he started from scratch. He's had some multi-site leadership experiences in a retail environment. He's done some consulting for some organizations. And of course, he's a co-author on the book and a co-founder of GriefLeaders with me. And as Mark said, this is a very specific niche of leadership, right? What we learned through our experiences, both personally and professionally, is that there's this moment in time where two worlds collide, right? This world of what happens in people's lives, and this world of being at work. And organizations that fail to recognize those two worlds coming together struggle. Their people struggle, right? Because you're asking the folks to check a big piece of who they are at the door and pretend like things aren't happening and like things are just wonderful when they're in the office. And so we recognized that and did some research around all of this, which I'll share with you here in a little bit. We recognized that there was a real gap in leadership here. And that, especially now in the COVID world, with folks being isolated at home and people losing loved ones and not being able to grieve those losses because funerals weren't happening, and all of the things that were brought about and that we learned from the new work at home world, that folks were struggling. Folks were struggling, and leaders, there's no leadership training to help folks deal with this gap. And so we wrote the book, which was sort of, we originally thought we were just going to start a consulting company. But then as folks like Mark and others were exposed to what we were doing, folks said, you guys should really put this down in writing and write a book. We've had the blessing of having folks like Mark and a couple of other best-selling authors in the leadership space. And the feedback we got was there's nothing out there to help leaders deal with this. And so as Mark and I talked, this falls squarely in the space of respect for people, right? In fact, to ignore what people are dealing with when they come to work is actually quite disrespectful, quite frankly. But again, I'm not faulting leaders there. There's really no training out there for leaders, right? This isn't taught in any business schools. It's not taught, there's no consulting companies that really focus on this, at least until now. So that's my background. That's my brother's background. And as you can see, the two come together very nicely in what we're dealing with here with the dying art of leadership. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about respect for people and the way I view respect for people. So, and I think this would be very much in line with the way Mark would view it as well. So that's the mindset I want you to be in. Forget everything we've talked about to this point, right? Just think about how you personally and your organization defines respect for leadership or respect for people. Most you'll see this hanging on a lot of walls, right? Dignity and respect, right? We treat our people with dignity and respect, which is great, but that's just sort of like the first step, I believe, in what it really means to treat people with respect or to have a respect for people. Organizations talk about teamwork and building a team and collaboration. That's certainly part of what I believe respect for people is, or a culture of respect for people. That means you're starting to break down the political activities that go on at work and some of the barriers that go on at work. Then, seek to understand, right? The whole go see, ask why, show respect principles of lean. This actually will tie into the next step on the ladder, but I firmly believe that leaders who realize that they need to understand, right, that they don't have to have all the answers, that they can in fact say, let's pull some people together and talk about this because I'm not sure what we really should do. Or, when faced with a problem, they don't immediately jump to a solution, but they actually do seek to understand and go out, as Mark would say, visit the Gemba and really, really understand what's going on in the real world and see what people are really dealing with. And as I said, that ties to the next challenge with respecting people, and that is, does your organization and is developing yourself and others a priority in your work environment? Oftentimes, this one gets a lot of actually, both of these last two get paid a lot of lip service. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, and it used to frustrate me all the time. As soon as the going gets tough, the first thing that gets cut is the training budget and the development budget. And I used to battle that all the time as a vice president of human resources. And frankly, it's one of the most important things that you can do for folks, is to constantly be learning, right? And that's what those two blocks that we just talked about are really all about, which is the learning culture that your organization has as part of its respect for people. And then we start to move into the really tough stuff, right? So is courage an operating principle of your organization, right? Are people expected to do what's right or to just follow the policies? And there's a big difference between those two things. And I see it all the time. And we used to really preach to our folks when I was working at Hillenbrand and Batesville Casket Company that we wanted you to do the right thing, right? You'd never get chastised for doing the right thing. Even if it meant that maybe you had to bend a policy or break a policy. Especially, courage is a very interesting thing. It's not only from that regard, but we want leaders who are willing to act with courage, even if there might be negative consequences to their actions on themselves. You still want to do you always want to do what's right. So is courage a part of your people approach to business? Is a question that we're very sensitive to, and that when we do our assessment, frankly, of an organization before we will start to engage in any consulting work with them. It's one of the things that we look for in organizations, is that culture of courage. And then the next one is compassion, which sort of goes hand in hand. An organization that and leaders that have an element of compassion to what they do will get, that's where you get followers, right? That's where you start to separate having direct reports and leadership being a title, with leadership being a true component of who you are, and how the organization operates. And compassion is not just feeling sorry for folks. And we'll talk about this a whole lot more over the next six months worth of sessions. Compassion is true caring, right? It's having the desire to care about your people as much as you care about yourself, right? In fact, there's another leader who I'm friends with, and I've heard speak on a number of occasions. His name is Colonel Arthur Athens, and he says there's 3 C's to leadership, and everyone in the organization above you and below you are looking for you to answer 3 questions around these 3 C's. The first one is competence. So are you competent in what you do, or are you working really hard? The self-development block on this chart. Are you working really hard to learn your role or to get competent in your role? The second C is courage, right? So do you have the courage to do what's right, even if it means there may be negative consequences as a result of doing what's right? And the third one is compassion. And the question with compassion, around compassion, is, do you care about others or the people who work for you as much as you care about yourself? And so those 3 questions are what everybody in the organization is looking to have you answer as a leader. And there are those moments of truth that pop up all the time, where you get to demonstrate through actions and not just words what your beliefs are. And so I found that really amazing, because he's a retired Marine colonel, right? And those 3 things, if you ask me what Marine leaders are like, I'm not sure that those 3 things, the competent one would probably come to mind, but I'm not sure that compassion would be on the list. And then the last one, the last component of respect for people that I believe needs to be present is vulnerability, right? And Mark touched on that in his opening comments. That's not only being able to admit that you've made a mistake, but it's being able to open up and share what's truly going on when you're struggling with things, right? It's admitting you've made a mistake. It's admitting you don't know the answers, but we can figure them out together. And frankly, it's sharing when you're struggling personally. Because if you want your people to share what's going on in their lives, so that the organization and the team can come together at a time when they need support the most, the leader needs to demonstrate that. Because quite frankly, what we've found is organizations, it's sort of interesting, organizations that perceive themselves as high performance cultures, or beat their chests that they're high performance cultures, may have inadvertently sent a message to their people that it's not okay to be vulnerable, and it's not okay to be compassionate, because that's to raise your hand and say, hey, I need help, in those cultures is often viewed as a sign of weakness. And even though that may not be what leaders believe, the culture, the high performance culture, and all the things that come with it, from top grading A talent and the focus on high performing teams and the focus on extraordinary results, right? If there isn't that balance, folks view all of that and say, well, geez, I clearly cannot raise my hand because my boss will view that as a sign of weakness, or the organization will view that as a sign of weakness. And that'll come back to haunt me in my review, or when I'm up for a promotion, or whatever the case may be. So I hope that makes sense. I should have said this early on, but if you have questions, feel free to type them in the comments section. And between Mark and I, we will try to keep an eye on that, and we'll answer them as we go along if need be. And certainly there'll be time at the end as well. So hopefully that makes sense. And it will prompt some thought about your own view of leadership and respect for people, as well as your organizations.
Hey, Anthony.
Yeah.
Can I just take a moment? It's kind of funny because every time Anthony and I have had a lot of conversations about this topic, and it's more than just a topic, but every time I talk to him, I learn something new. Just when you think you understand it all, something else comes up. Respect for people, if you go back to Toyota, which, by the way, that was influenced by a lot of people like Deming and Duran and all kinds of different people that influenced their thinking on this. It's probably misworded because it's not just about people, it's about all stakeholders, which includes customers and shareholders. It includes the environment, society, community, and even their competition, okay, which is mind-boggling to me, right, how they think. But as I'm sitting here and I'm looking at those slides that he just put up and Anthony just put up, and you say, okay, well, I think there's a couple other stakeholders here that we may be missing. And this just occurred to me, maybe not to Anthony, but to me. So if you think about a grieving employee that has to come to work, and let's say they're mistreated in whatever regard because of that, right? Well, first of all, a stakeholder is their coworkers. They're going to feel the effect, or people that work for them, right? But what about their family when they go home at night? Okay, that's another stakeholder here. So it's not just about the employee. Okay, it's about the family that they go home to with that accentuated aggravation, grief, stress, whatever you want to call it, that's going to have an effect not just on their coworkers, but when they go home and their family and everything else. And even from a safety perspective, God, if you're stressed and you're driving home and you're not focused, and who knows? I mean, that's how I have a good friend that does stuff with distracted driving, and it's usually when you're distracted, and it doesn't mean that you're reaching for your coffee. It could be you're distracted mentally. So it's a safety issue too. I mean, this all ties together into all the lean concepts that we talked about yesterday. And so I'm sitting here saying, every time I listen to Anthony, I learn something new, or something comes into my mind that says, wow, there's a lot to this. And it's not just as easy as, oh, I got to be kind to Charlie, So
Right.
Anyway, I'll stop there, but I just want to point that out, Anthony, that you, again, pushed my mind into another area that I haven't realized before. So
Cool. Well, hopefully some others on the line have had similar experiences. And I noticed in the chat room, apparently we have a couple of ex-Marines on the line. So thank you for your service there. And if you get a chance, quite frankly, search Colonel Arthur Athens. He's got several videos out on YouTube. He actually teaches at the Naval Academy. He teaches leadership at the Naval Academy. And the videos that I have seen are around some capstone program talks that he has given. And he's a pretty remarkable guy. So I thought we would take just a moment here, and I'll flip these up really quickly. Won't read these to you, but from a leader's perspective, right? And Mark just mentioned Toyota, right? So the chairman of the board of Toyota said, first we build people, then we build cars, right? Very, very telling view of what comes first with Toyota. General Schwarzkopf from the US military, right? Leadership is a potent combination of strategy and character. And I actually had a chuckle when I read this, but then he went on to say, and if you got to do without one, do without strategy, which I thought was interesting. This one is from, I think, Simon Sinek, and it talks about people needing to feel psychologically or emotionally safe at work. And that's really what we're talking about here, right? That's the true respect for people, right? When you can elevate your leadership to the point where people feel emotionally and psychologically safe at work, now you are operating on a true plane of respect for people, at least in my opinion. Another one from General Schwarzkopf. Let you just take a peek at that one. This talks about doing what's right, right? We talked about that, having the courage to do what you think is right. Richard Branson. Leaders have to make a positive difference for others. Another Simon Sinek quote. So anyway, just some different perspectives from different leaders on respect for people and those steps in the process that we just talked about. Again, another Richard Branson quote. So the real question is, and I had mentioned we look for those steps when we do our assessment, when we come into organizations. Real question is, has your organization really moved beyond dignity and respect to some of those other levels? And have you, frankly, as a leader, right? That would be the challenge of today's session, would be to really think about those stepping stones, some of the things that Mark mentioned. And are you really pushing the boundaries of demonstrating true respect for people? Or are you really just sort of back at step one, which is, well, I try not to offend anybody kind of thing. So, okay, let's move forward now to defining the issue. And that's really what today's topic was intended to be all about, was to just sort of define the gap. This is from our research, right? So as we've talked about grief in the workplace, right? No organization is immune to this. Every single leader, every single person will face this issue. And frankly, right now, as we are on the line here together, an estimated 1 in 4 employees are impacted by something in their life that will likely or has likely put them into a state of grief, and is actually experiencing one of the 5 stages of grief. And this shocked me. First of all, I didn't realize that there'd actually been any research around lost productivity due to grief in the workplace, but the Grief Recovery Institute did a study a few years back, and $75 to $100 billion a year is attributable to grieving employees in the workplace. And no amount of Kaizen will ever reveal these costs, right? Because you can't see all of the distraction, right? You can't see the times when people are just staring at their computer because they're unable to think, right? Mark mentioned distracted driving, right? And I did an article on a woman who, on her family, that she passed away from COVID, and talked about the differences between 2 years ago if an elderly person died from the flu, and this year if an elderly person died from COVID, and how families are reacting differently. And one of the questions I posed at the end of that is, what if her son was returning to work and he's an over-the-road truck driver? Do you really want him coming up behind you in a construction zone, right? His eyes are on the road, but his mind is a million miles away. And if an accident happens, they're going to test him for drugs. They might pull his cell phone and see if he was texting while he was driving, but nobody's ever going to ask if he was grieving. And so we need to be, to Mark's point about safety, we need to be very careful, frankly, because these can be safety issues. And frankly, the accident reports and the incident reports and all of the safety reporting is probably never going to talk about what was going on in this person's life, and were they distracted while they were working. So huge problem, right? In fact, in the interviews that we've done, we always get asked, what are the aha moments around the work that we do and around writing the book? And this was two of them. The 1 in 4 grieving employees and the $75 to $100 billion a year were sort of two big aha moments for Guy and I when we wrote the book. And then we talked about, there's been very little written on this. It's not taught in any business schools. There's no leadership training on the topic until now. There are leadership companies that tell you they will deal with this, but they basically just give you a hey, don't do this or don't say that type of worksheet. But there's really no training, as opposed to what we are doing, which is, we will teach you the adaptive leadership model. We'll come in and do the assessment of the type of culture you have, teach you the adaptive leadership model, and then teach leaders how to use this when those two worlds sort of collide, right? Where the world of grief and things that are going on in people's life and the world of work and leadership sort of collide in the moment. That's the niche that our expertise shines. Okay, so we've sort of given away what we're talking about here. And so I won't go through the word association quite the way I had planned out, but typically, well, let's do it. In the comments section, what's the first word that comes to mind when you hear the words grief or grieving? If you guys want to just type in a comment there and tell me what the word is that comes to mind, we can do that. And so typically what we find as folks answer that question is everybody defines grief through the lens of the loss of a loved one or a death. And frankly, that's the smallest piece, right? It's the most visible piece, but it's also the smallest piece. The reality of the situation is that any emotionally traumatic event that's significant enough to alter a person's sense of reality will cause them to grieve. And when you look at the world through that lens, then the list becomes endless of the things that can cause a person to grieve. And I've got some of them here on this chart. Divorce, right? I could share a situation with you of someone that I'm connected to on LinkedIn that was horrifying, but she went in, she was dealing with a divorce, custody of her child, didn't know if she'd be able to pay her bills once her husband left. And she raised her hand and went in to talk to her director. And the director's response was, this is just a blip on your radar screen, you'll get over it. And she was really struggling through this whole process. Domestic abuse, financial struggles, significant illness, right? So think about someone who either has personally gotten a diagnosis or a very close family member has gotten a significant illness diagnosis. And the one that's on here that I think most organizations never think about is the stress and significant shift in people's realities that your own company initiatives create. Having shut down a plant and taken the shift out of another one, as well as some other situations that I've had to deal with as the head of supply chain or as the president of Rotex, the operating division, I can tell you, we often tag people as being resistant to change, when in reality, they're really just going through the stages of grief, right? A person who is in denial, a person who is angry, a person who is depressed may not, and oftentimes is not, the same as a person who's resistant to change, right? It's just that their world is getting rocked to a point that their reality is changing and they have to adjust to that. And leaders who can be sensitive to that actually can get initiatives to happen smoother, faster, and likely more effectively than those who are trying to manage the performance issues of people they believe are resistant to change, right? And we will actually talk more about that as we move through the sessions in the coming months. So these are two interesting charts, because one that wasn't on there is the social events that can trigger grief. The chart on the left is the Black Lives protests of 2020, right? So the Black Lives Matter protests. There were a lot of people who were impacted by that. And I know for a fact that my brother had an employee whose parents lived in an area where Black Lives protests were significant. And she was incredibly distracted at work, worried about her parents and what was going on in their neighborhood, and whether or not they required care, and she was responsible for that care, and whether or not she would actually be able to get to where they lived, because she would have to cross through an active protest zone. It was amazing, the discussions that my brother had with her, and the way that he had to adapt his leadership to help support her and allow her the flexibility to be able to do what she needed to do to take care of her parents. And the one on the right is mass shootings that occurred in the month of April, just in the month of April, which was shocking to me. And there's one right there in the middle of the state of Indiana, which happened right in my own backyard in Indianapolis. And I can tell you, any city, when you look at that map, you suddenly realize that any city in the country could be the next city where one of these episodes occurs. And our leaders really prepared to handle that, right? I would argue the leaders in Indianapolis were not. And I would argue that the leaders in the next city where they have to deal with this, right? The one in Indianapolis, for those of you who don't know, actually happened at a Federal Express facility, a large Federal Express facility in Indianapolis. And I think 4 people or 6 people were killed. And a lot of people were rocked to their core, right? Nobody pulls up to work and thinks, gee, I wonder if today that the environment here is not going to be safe for me. But that was the case for, hundreds and hundreds of employees that showed up to work at the Federal Express facility. So just 2 examples of how social events can also trigger grief in the workplace. And we need to give people the opportunity to talk about it and share what they're thinking, and then if possible, help support them through whatever it is they're dealing with.
Anthony, as I try to learn more about this, and I've been studying a lot of the great clinical psychologists of our time, which is a pretty interesting field for me to look at. I've learned, one view of psychology is that the human condition is just naturally one of a grieving type of condition, and so it doesn't even have to be an event. That just to live as a human being is faced with so many challenges on a day-to-day basis, so many issues. Some issues you may look at and say, that's nothing. What are you worried about? To some people, it's a big deal, right? So just the nature of being a human being brings what you're talking about to the forefront. It's not even like, oh, geez, I lost my aunt last week, or I'm getting a divorce. Yeah, those things just accentuate it. But what I'm learning through all my studies with psychology is that the human condition itself is one of natural, if you want to call it grieving or suffering. Okay. And so I just thought I'd throw that in there. So it doesn't even sometimes have to be an event, which basically means it's not just about Mary or Joe who lost his mother. It's about everybody, right? So the awareness of how we have to lead really has to be an all-encompassing thought process, if you will, a culture, and not just, hey, oh yeah, Mary's coming in, he lost her mother, I better do something different for Mary. No, it's everybody, to one regard or another. Everybody's going to be in the grieving mode all the time, but accentuates at different points in their life. So it's not just a spot type of leadership that you have to do. In my opinion, it's just how you have to lead, period.
Right.
All the time. Right. I mean, that's so.
Right. Right. So. And that's actually when we get to the module on adaptive leadership, while we apply adaptive leadership to the grief world, what we really teach in the sessions is this is how leaders should lead all the time, right? And without getting into that here, but that's to your point, Mark. And it's I tell people all the time, all you have to do is watch an episode of any episode of Undercover Boss, and you will see what it is that Mark was just talking about, right? The stress levels and the things that people deal with in their personal lives that we often have no clue are going on, but are actually impacting them at work. And leaders tend to manage the performance piece and not actually try to understand what's really going on in the employee's life and in their situation. And I just opened up a comment, and Mark, there's one there for you. I don't know if you can see that, but it says, Mark, if you haven't read it yet, check out the optimism. Yep. Thanks, Earl. Got it. Yep. And Earl, I saw your earlier comment too about the FedEx thing happening right in your own backyard, and several folks in your neighborhood who actually worked at the facility and how it rocked their world. So thanks for contributing that to the conversation. So we'll quickly go through these slides, these next groups. But one of the questions we get all the time is, well, people don't want to talk about this at work. And the reality is they do, right? And I won't spend a lot of time looking at these or talking about these, but I'll just let you quickly scan this. Several Harvard Business Review articles about dealing with grief in the workplace and how to cope with grief at work. When a colleague is grieving, some research about employers and mental health and how employees want to be able to talk about that at work. A management tip of the day back in March, managing an employee with depression, how CEOs can support employee mental health, be an emotionally supportive colleague without prying. All of this is dealing with the topic that we're talking about, and where the things that rock people's world outside of work and the work life, where those two things sort of collide, and how leaders should deal with them. The Washington Post, I really like this one because it put our company's name right in the title of the article, which was awesome. But when the world's in crisis, we need grief leaders. Here's how to become one. This was just this past January. McKinsey put out a report, The Hidden Perils of Unresolved Grief in the Workplace. And then, of course, the one that was most impactful to us is every single conversation we had with people we talked to about the book and continue to talk to. Folks have either said, I was so thankful I could talk about my situation at work because it made things so much easier knowing I could raise my hand and ask for help, or just go into my boss's office and be honest about what was going on and the stress I was under. Or they said, I wish I had been able to talk about my situation at work. So, it's easy to think this is too emotional, this is too awkward, this is too personal, but the reality is your people really do want to talk about this if the leader will set the right tone and the right environment. So to wrap this session up and then turn it over to some questions, here's some images that if you don't remember anything that Mark and I said from today's conversation, if you will just remember these pictures, then we will have had the impact that I had hoped. So the first one was around the whole respect for people, and how do you really define respect for people, and is your leadership reflective of this definition? The second one is the impact of grief in the workplace, and the fact that very little of this is taught, right? There's no business school in the country that teaches this. the fact that any emotionally traumatic event, not just the loss of a loved one, that tends to be the most common thing we think about. But any emotionally traumatic event that's significant enough to impact a person's or alter a person's sense of reality will cause them to grieve, right? Including the things that are going on at work with your own initiatives. Your people want to talk about this. And then finally, I love this quote from an author, James Autry, who's a business leader, and he's written several books. This quote happens to come from Confessions of an Accidental Businessman. Business schools don't teach anything about what a manager says when someone comes in and says, I have cancer, right? You're never taught how to deal with that moment. And my brother and I, with Mark's help and the help of some others, are trying to change that. And provide leaders with some tools and some guidance on how do you handle folks when that occurs. So I think this is a good stopping point. We're at about the 45-minute mark. If you've got any questions or any comments, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll take a look at those. From a connection standpoint, you can order the book on Amazon. Just go to Amazon Books, The Dying Art of Leadership, or through BookBaby. Certainly, you can visit us on our website at GriefLeaders, or connect with me directly on, or email me, directly at acasablanca@griefleaders.com. And by the way, that C in Casablanca should not be capitalized. Sorry about that. I didn't catch that when I put the slides together. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn if we're not already connected. Mark your calendars for July 23rd. June 23rd. That will be the next session where we'll talk about emotional safety and the conversations that your people want to have with you. And then, finally, I lost it there, but let me go back here and grab the screen share. If you will email me or message me, I will send you a link to the 25% off the purchase of the book through BookBaby. So just shoot me a quick email at my GriefLeaders email, or shoot me a message on LinkedIn, and I'll give you the discount code when we connect. So, all right. So I see there. Let's see what we have here. Thanks, Earl. I'll check it out. Okay. It's a great book. Well, thanks for that, Earl. Appreciate that. So, Mark, I don't know if you've got anything that you want to say, or any questions here at the end.
Yeah, I don't have a question. Well, I have a lot of questions, but and by the way, I just want to let you know, Anthony, you failed the biggest reason for grief. When the Boston Red Sox lost the World Series to the Mets, I was in grief. Okay, just to let you know. Okay,
yes, I can imagine. I can imagine.
That's worse than death or divorce or anything. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't make to make fun. I'm sorry. I like to have humor and have fun sometimes, but this is serious. I have a question now, and actually, if Earl is still on, or any other veteran, Earl is a friend of ours. He's a Marine, and he's a friend of Anthony's and mine. And so I've done a lot of work with veterans, and not in the PTSD realm, but really to help them with their careers and their businesses. And one of the things I did learn in dealing with veterans, and by the way, Earl has a great podcast if you haven't checked it out.
Yeah.
On leadership, by the way.
The Burden of Command.
The Burden of Command. You got to check it out. Matter of fact, you got to check it out too, because Anthony and I have been both interviewed by Earl, so that's another reason to check it out, or maybe a reason to stay away. I don't know, but Earl. So what I've learned is that, and I've talked to a lot of veterans about this, when they come back from war, the first thing they do, and my sons were both in the theater of war in the Middle East. When they came back, they have them meet a counselor. And they just want to check and make sure you're okay and all that. But and they were asking you all kinds of questions and how you feel and all that. And a lot of veterans I talked to, including my son, said, we're hesitant to really talk to these guys, because we want to go back into war. We want to go, we don't want to end our career in all that. So they're not always honest with what they tell these counselors, right? And as a result, PTSD is a big deal with the military. We were losing 22 to suicide a day. It's probably higher now, Earl, I don't know, because of COVID, because isolation doesn't help that at all. But when Anthony says, well, geez, everybody wants to talk about it, and I kind of believe that. But the question is, will they? And if you go back to that environment that leader creates in the workplace is going to dictate whether or not there's a trusting relationship where you can open up to your leader, right? Now, I know in the military, they're afraid, a lot of guys are afraid to do that because of the implications that it might have on their future. So, Earl, I don't know, being a military guy and having seen most of what people haven't seen in this world, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, I think you just nailed it right on the head there, right? Is folks want to talk about it, but they don't want to deal with the stigma that could come from being that vulnerable and that open. And again, you nailed it there, Dan. It's the leadership part, right? Because as soon as people start being vulnerable and authentic and sharing their grief and opening up those wounds and wanting to vent, if you will, we start wanting to slap labels on it like PTSD, and we start wanting to treat that person like they're broken or they're less than. And that's where, I think Anthony's work is so powerful, is it equips leaders with the ability to have those conversations, have those legitimate conversations with people who are in these periods of grief, and not treat them like they're somebody who's fragile, not treat them like somebody who's broken, not treat them like somebody who needs to be packaged up and just treated with kid gloves. Because sometimes that's the worst thing you can do with somebody in grief is treat them different, treat them like they're broken goods. And so to your point, I agree 100%. It's this kind of self-licking ice cream cone here a little bit, where the military wants people to talk about it, but when they talk about it, they want to put them in these mental health programs because they're afraid that by talking about it, that they're creating PTSD type issues. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. Is the work you guys are doing here is so fantastic, because leaders are so ill-equipped to deal with these types of things right now.
Yeah, I think the first thing that Anthony said is define the problem. Even know that you have the problem as a leader is a big step forward, I think, because you can't solve a problem unless you define it. So I just thought I'd get your perspective on that, Earl, because I know that you've, like I said, seen things that a lot of people haven't seen and shouldn't see, actually, but which is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, brother. Thanks for including me, and great, great stuff here. I'm hoping that everybody here is just kind of being quiet and soaking it in, because they're awestruck by the awesome knowledge that y'all are sharing right now, because it's great work.
I appreciate that. Thanks. All right. Anything else? Hopefully folks will, if you're not connected with me, please do so, because I'd love to be able to chat with you on LinkedIn or through our website and emailing directly. So please connect, spread the word, because we'd love to have more people on next month's session as we talk further about the emotional safety and how to create that type of environment, that type of culture in the workplace. And I really appreciate everyone's time. We're coming right up here on about an hour, about 53 minutes. So if there are no other questions, I do appreciate everyone being on the line, and please reach out to me. Be happy to send you the discount code for the book if you haven't already picked one up. And I look forward to seeing you next month. So
Anthony, if I'm not mistaken, you're uploading this to YouTube. Is that what you're going to do?
I will. Yes. Okay. Yes. We will be uploading this to, we've been recording this, and we will be uploading this to YouTube. Correct.
Thanks, Mark. I'll be posting the link on my LinkedIn post, and then I'm sure you will as well. So.
Right.
Okay.